Hello, and welcome to AGVEL's 2023 Global Listening and Spoken Language Virtual Symposium. I am Emilio Alonso Mendoza, proud to be the CEO of the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm very happy to welcome today nearly 700 professionals in listening and spoken language from more than 40 countries. Our focus is to ensure that every child who can benefit from listening and spoken language has a qualified and caring professional to support their advancement. You're joining us for 2 full days of learning, connecting, and growing, and we're very happy to see and hear you. We're very pleased to now have 1,100 certified professionals around the world. That's 1,100. But so many more are needed. And this is what makes our continuing education so vital to our field. We are committed to hosting this annual symposium to provide you with ways to earn many continuing education credits with the most up-to-date information in our field. Throughout this symposium, you'll hear from an array of wonderful and talented listening and spoken language professionals from across the globe. Our keynote speakers will deliver the latest information on research in our field. And I am really looking forward to the forums on innovations in technology from our key sponsors, Cochlear Americas, Akuos, and Medell. And before we get started, I would like to thank the many people who made this symposium possible. AGVEL is grateful for the guidance and supports of the members of our board of directors. They're there for us all the time, so thank you. We also want to thank the 2023 Symposium Core Committee members. They come from 6 countries, and they have a commitment to bring high-quality education to all of you. A special thank you goes to co-chairs Lilian Flores Beltran from Mexico, Terry Ouellette from Indianapolis, Indiana, and Trudy Smith from Australia. They attended many meetings and encouraged many of you to participate in the symposium. We're also thankful for the 40 volunteer ambassadors who reach out to encourage professionals in their countries. We will name all the countries later on tomorrow, maybe, and you're going to be so pleased when you see what a turnout we had this year. I also want to recognize the committee of key sponsors of the Global Symposium who help to ensure that this event takes place, but also contribute their knowledge to the program. Our Cradle to Career partners are year-long sponsors who help us bring to life new ideas. We want to thank Akuos and Decibel for their support of AGVEL, as well as Cochlear Americas, who bring the parent support line and parent chats to you. Be sure to share those resources with the families you serve. I also want to thank Medell, CapTel, RIT, National Technical Institute for the Deaf, Decibel Therapeutics, Hamilton CapTel, the Paul School for Hearing and Speech, St. Joseph's Institute for the Deaf, the Central Institute for the Deaf, ASHA, Sunshine Cottage, and Auditory Verbal Center. They are all have incorporated their support of the symposium. Special thanks are also due to the National Institute on Deafness and Communication Disorders for their conference grant. This grant not only supports our keynote speakers, but also supports the symposium proceedings after the event. Additional, NIDCD has funded registration scholarships to enable 40 students, and AGVEL funded 10 students from several countries to benefit from symposium education. Professional scholarships have also been provided through a special fund drive. We are grateful for your commitment to supporting high-quality education for professionals all over the world. Thank you to all our volunteers, our speakers, and supporters. I want to thank our staff members who have worked tirelessly to bring this symposium to you. But in particular, I'd like to thank somebody that is very special to the staff, and I'm sure very special to you, and that is Gayla Guinar, our Chief Strategy and Programs Officer, who has been inspirational to us all and is inspirational to me every day. Along with Gayla, I would like to thank our 130 symposium presenters. You are what makes this 2023 symposium fresh, unique, informative, and inspiring. And please now join me in a round of applause, a virtual round of applause, for all of those who have been involved in making the next 2 days valuable and memorable. Thank you. And now, without further ado, Gayla.
Thank you, Emilio. Hello to everyone from AG Bell. For me, these are the two most exciting days of the year. It's when we come together to learn and connect, and I could not be more excited. I love to see what happens. And while AG Bell and our volunteer committees, which have been really involved, many people who've put this symposium together, are excited, and we've carefully planned the symposium, what really makes it so wonderful is what the presenters bring to us, and then what you as attendees bring to the chat and to the conversation that's happening out there. We encourage you to please communicate on social media, whether that's Facebook or any social media. Let people know what's happening at the AG Bell Symposium. So I think even better than being here is what we take away from this experience. And that's because you will take your individual learning and impact the area that you're from in the world, whether that is Brazil, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Lebanon, or Chile, India, Japan, China, Australia, Israel, Denmark, Finland, or the United Kingdom, South Africa, Kenya, United States, or somewhere else. We're thrilled to have you here, and we welcome you. So again, we want to make sure that everyone is able to stay online and learning. So it's very important that we acknowledge that you know who our players are. The foundational support we receive, again, this year from Blue Sky eLearning is there's nothing better. They have been terrific partners. Now this is our fourth symposium working with them. Their Path Learning Management System is what we are using, and they have their tech experts with us in every session, and which is just wonderful. We also want to thank AI Media, who is here again this year to provide captioning, and Amtrad, first year with them, out of Mexico, who are providing oral translation. We'll have a terrific symposium. Casey Judd of Conference Direct is behind the scenes with the whole team, along with Dr. Joni Alberg, who is leading our moderators and our question and answer language facilitators. There are a few more things. We'll get started in just a moment, but there are a few more things to share with you that will help you navigate the symposium. Your ability to stay online and to follow what is happening is very much related to your own internet connection and bandwidth. The first way to try to improve your connection is always to select your refresh button. And sometimes you just have to leave and then come back to the room. New this year, English captioning, you should already be seeing it, will run across the bottom of the screen. You can use the control panel. I call it sort of your driver pod. You'll see it on the right side of your screen as you navigate through sessions. There is a captions tab. And you can choose from all 6 languages there that we are captioning this year. And there is also the farthest tab over a translation, an oral translation tab, and we are translating in English and Spanish. So if a session is being presented in English and you would like to hear it in Espanol, then you will select the tab that says Espanol. If you're listening to a presenter present in Spanish, then you'll select the tab when it says English, and you'll be able to hear that oral translation. I do want you to know, sometimes there's a delay in captioning, and that often cannot be helped, but continue to stay with us. We have all done our very best to make sure that communication access is as good as possible, and we just appreciate the fact that we're able to provide it and that you're here and participating. Remember, what you are not able to participate in this year, these 2 days, the live symposium, we have 19 hours, but what you're not able to participate in, you can come back during the on-demand portion of the conference. You have registered for the symposium. That's a 2-for-1 experience. You get to come to the live 2-day conference today and tomorrow, and then come back from July 25th all the way to September 15th. That's 8 weeks for the on-demand symposium, and listen to all 52 hours of the continuing education. So you can even watch sessions over and over again. As attendees, you will not be able to use your microphone to communicate with the presenter or other attendees. That's why we have a chat, and I can already see that the audience has learned that the chat is there, it's open. We encourage you to please connect with others, greet and meet others in the chat. Throughout the symposium, you'll have access to the chat. You'll also have access to your presenters by answering or asking questions in our Q&A pod. It's called Slido. We've added some special sessions this year. They're called conversations, and you can access those sessions through Path as well. All sessions will be recorded. However, the audience will only be viewable. Your faces and names will only be viewable during those conversation chats. Those are happening at midday today and tomorrow and towards the end of this day. There will be 15-minute breaks in between every session, and there will be video content with announcements during those breaks as you enter the next session. Please keep an eye out for that content, and also QR codes that will help you find all the information you need about AGBEL programs, such as our new Young Leaders program for individuals post-high school up to about age 40. You'll also see information about the AGBEL Academy and LS certification. Last, we're almost there. We're almost ready to start. But last, I must say a few words about CEUs, continuing education. Those are available to individuals who have registered as professionals for the symposium. And to be awarded continuing education units or any credit for hours connected to the symposium, you must participate in the entire session. We'll give you a few minutes to be late, and if you have to leave a few minutes early, certainly don't worry about that. But essentially, you will need to be at most of the session in order to gain credit, and we are aware of who is on and in the symposium at all times. Also, you will need to complete the continuing education grid. It's a very easy process. So I am not able to do a screen share right now, but what you'll see is on the landing page, you'll see an icon that says CEU grid, and that's how you open it up. You need to complete just one CEU grid. I wish I could do a screen share. That's not going to work out, but here's what you do. Open one up, be sure to fill in your name and other required information as you attend the symposium, and you can save the CEU grid as you go. Jotform, which is where we have that CEU grid stored, will email you an edit link whenever you save or submit. Each time you want to reopen your CEU grid, go to your email and just update the form. It's very, very easy. If you use Jotform in some other way in your work, be sure to log out of it before you open and use our form. It's very important to fill out that form completely, and be sure to indicate the types of CEUs you wish to earn at the top of each day on the grid. Here's the great thing about the CEU form. If you end up submitting it, it's no big deal. You just open it up again in your email and edit it. CEUs, the final form, the final submission must happen no later than July 7th. And when it is time for the on-demand from July 25th, the on-demand symposium, July 25th through September 15th, you'll fill out a new CEU form, and you'll just do one at that time as well. A certificate of attendance will be downloadable at the end of the symposium. And the same is also true of being able to download an evaluation form. And we certainly hope that you will evaluate the symposium. We look at every response and we do our planning according to the feedback we receive. A certificate of learning with CEU amounts will be emailed to you at the email you've provided approximately 30 to 45 days following the symposium. Now let's transition to the symposium and our first keynote presentation. I've taken a minute of her time. Enjoy your symposium. Turn it over to the moderators.
Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the A.G. Bell Symposium over these next 2 days. My name is Peter Steiger, and I am at the Bellucci Translational Hearing Research Center at Creighton University. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today our first keynote speaker for this symposium. And her name is Dr. Lisa Hunter. And she is a highly experienced audiologist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and at the University of Cincinnati. She's a renowned pediatric hearing researcher with interests in collaborations in speech and language development, psychology, neonatology, and neuroimaging. And I am particularly fortunate to be one of her collaborators. Her NIH-funded research focuses on the effects of prematurity on hearing and language delay, and that is the focus of her presentation today. Dr. Hunter also has a passion for addressing the systemic effects of poor access to hearing healthcare and early intervention. The title of her presentation today is The Early Detection of Hearing Loss and Language Delay in Infants Born Prematurely. And the mic is all yours now, Lisa. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a special honor having you give such a kind introduction. And I had the privilege of visiting with Peter and participating in the recent Bellucci Symposium at Creighton University, and they're doing just fantastic work there. So it's really nice to have that connection here today. And I'm especially thrilled to be asked to present to all of you today at this virtual symposium. I know it can feel a little bit different. I can't see your faces, and I regret that, but I do think it's wonderful that so many people from across the world are able to participate this way without flying millions of miles and burning up carbon and all of those things. So there's an upside to it as well, but I do regret not being able to meet you in person and have those individual chats, but hopefully in another forum. Normally, as Peter mentioned, I'm working at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is shown right here in the second panel, and I'm very lucky to actually work in this building. This hospital is so dedicated not only to clinical care, but to research that they've really invested enormous amounts of their foundation in these not only physical structures, but in people, the more important part. who I get to work with, and in facilities like this MRI suite that's shown here over on the right, which is so key to the research that I'm going to be talking with you about today. So I would not want to miss acknowledging the whole team that I'm lucky to work with, because this is really team science that we're going to talk about today, and the interdisciplinary collaboration that I have with Dr. Jennifer Van Nest, who's a speech language researcher at Children's and also at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Nahal Parikh, who originally started with the older cohort that I'm going to talk with you about today. And his special interest has been in predicting motor problems, especially cerebral palsy and cognitive problems. And he just jumped at the chance to expand this into hearing and speech language. So he's really thinking about the whole child and family in his research program. Dr. David Moore, who I am fortunate enough to not only collaborate with, but be married to. And he's actually here listening today and interested in what we have to say. And he comes from a neuroscience perspective. And then Dr. Maria Barnes Davis, who is also a neonatologist and has excellent expertise in EEG research, which we are using in this study. Chelsea Blankenship is an outstanding postdoctoral research associate. You'll be hearing a lot more about her in years to come. And she's been doing most of the EEG and ABR recordings that I'm lucky enough to talk about today. And then Lauren Prather and Cisan Cuervo are both Ph.D. students in speech language who have been working with us and doing some of their doctoral research with us. And actually, Lauren, in addition to the wonderful funding that we've been able to receive from NIDCD, Lauren received a supplement diversity grant to do some work in Black children's language. And then Jody Caldwell-Kurtzman, who is actually the heart of it all, she's our senior research coordinator, and she makes it possible because she connects with all these families that we have a really, really high retention rate over a 5-year longitudinal study so far. So to continue on, so prematurity, you see in your work a lot of children who were premature, a lot of them who are doing so much better now because of all of the efforts of the neonatologists who have managed to allow them to survive this very, very challenging time when they're so fragile. And we see babies that are born as young as 23 weeks these days who are surviving. But of course, the younger they are when they're born, the more likely they'll have these multiple adverse developmental outcomes that include both hearing, speech, language, and lots of other problems that we'll talk about. And it's a really common problem. 10% of all births in the US are premature. And unfortunately, for developed countries, we have one of the highest rates of prematurity in the developed world. And so it's something that really needs a lot of effort and attention to improve. And of course, developmental disabilities are really common, especially in the babies who are born very or extremely preterm. And that is defined as less than 32 weeks gestational age at the time that they're born. So speech language and hearing, of course, cognition, vision, and motor disorders are quite common. Any of these can occur, and they can occur in combination. So we may see children, many of the children we see who we talk as being deaf plus or hard of hearing plus have these other problems. There's also an increased risk for autism and cerebral palsy, as well as ADHD with preterm birth. But we can't really predict which babies are going to have which problems. And so when they're born, we don't know exactly what kind of therapy they're going to need. And that includes hearing loss. Fortunately for us, we have universal newborn hearing screening. And that started, actually, my career started, the very first job that I had was doing hearing screening in the neonatal intensive care unit. And I've just been drawn to that ever since. I keep finding that that's an area that I really love to work in. But these are invisible disabilities. We know that hearing loss and speech language delay are often coexisting. They're often not picked up until the child is older. Fortunately, as I said, with hearing loss, we can pick it up sooner. But very to extremely preterm babies have a 3 to 10-fold increase in the risk for these problems. Another issue that we want to bring up is noise in the NICU and auditory development, because of course this can play a role in excess noise and potentially damage, not only medically, because babies have higher risk for increased blood pressure and other problems, and it could intersect with things like aminoglycosides, because there's an inflammatory process that may be worse when we have noise, especially in excess of 45 dB. These babies are born weeks earlier than they should have been. They would have been in a very different acoustic environment than they are in the NICU. Most NICUs have done a lot to try to bring down these noise levels. In fact, some are so successful that now we're worried about it being too quiet. And so it can vary dramatically. In the NICUs that haven't been treated acoustically, the average noises are 70 to 80 dB, but can exceed 120. So that's clearly risky, not only for the baby's health, but also for their hearing. But if we make it super quiet and they're not having the normal language and acoustic stimulation that they should from their caregivers, from their parents, that can be problematic for their development as well. Another thing that I want to highlight is that we're probably only seeing the tip of the iceberg with newborn hearing screening. We do a really good job at picking up moderate to profound hearing loss, sort of okay with mild hearing loss, but we're likely missing most slight hearing losses. And that's because we have our criteria set at a level where we're not over detecting babies that have just temporary fluid in the ears when they're born, but we may be under detecting slight to mild sensorineural hearing losses. And of course, those can go on and progress if they're present. So that's something that we're really looking at with this study. So what is slight to mild hearing loss? Well, it's beyond the green area in this audiogram, familiar sounds audiogram. So above 15 dB on average, and you can see our much beloved speech banana falls below that. So the idea is that if we pick up hearing of at least 15 dB or greater, hearing losses of 15 dB or greater, that we'd be able to amplify and bring in sounds across the entire speech spectrum. But we know that if we're skating at 15 to 25 or even 30 dB, we may not have picked that hearing loss up, and those children may miss especially the softer sounds and the higher frequency sounds, and especially at a distance, right? Or especially when there's noise or any other type of difficult acoustic environment. So slight to mild hearing loss technically is 15 to 40 dBHL. We know that it affects speech language development and academic progress, but currently we have a really hard time picking it up. And infants cared for in the NICU are definitely at greater risk for all degrees of hearing loss. So rates of hearing loss that we find really depend on the definition and age. This is a really interesting figure. It's pulled from a couple of different sources, from the CDC, EDI data, from NHANES survey, and also reviewed by NIDCD. And you can see that at birth, the rates of moderate to profound hearing loss are about 1.7 overall per 1,000, 3 per 1,000 if we include slight to mild hearing loss. But we think we're not always detecting it, because as you can see, if we go way over here to the right, 6 to 19 years of age, we have 30 times the prevalence of slight to mild hearing loss at school age than we have at birth. And we've got this like missing gap in here around 3 years of age, where moderate to profound hasn't really increased, but we don't know anything about slight to mild loss because those kids are the most difficult to test, and there's not a good way to screen at that time, and there's no universal screening around that age. So somewhere these hearing losses increased, but were they there all along, or have they really increased that much from birth, to school age? This is a nice study that was actually done by my collaborator, David Moore, here in the UK, where we are right now. And this is looking at slight to mild loss that's undetected in primary school children. So you can see that's up to 35 dB in these kids. Most of them have very normal hearing, but we've got this tail of kids that have some hearing loss. And this was detected in a large sample of school children using automated audiometry. So we should have more of them down below 0, but it didn't go down that low. So probably, this part should be higher. But nevertheless, if we look up at these slight to mild losses, what I'm going to show you in the next slide is if you look at a range of developmental issues, from speech and noise ability to language skills to memory, nonverbal IQ, shown here, word reading, pseudo or non-word reading, general communication ability, and then the CHAPS, which is a questionnaire. You see that there are some of these that interestingly start to take off with a higher probability of low performance once we exceed 10 dB threshold on average. And you can see this sort of accelerating risk of low performance, so that by the time we get to 25 dB hearing level, we've got a 3 times greater risk of low performance, or about 15% on language skills, memory, pseudo word reading in particular. And so we see that there's a real relationship between slight to mild hearing loss and some of the most important skills for academic progress. I should say, I'm sorry I didn't say it at the beginning, but please do put anything in the chat that you're interested in or want to hear more about, or questions that you have, but we'll take questions at the end, and then I want to make sure I allow time for that. Now, if we look at prematurity, the developmental trajectories that we see are that there's kind of 3 groups of children. Shown here, the green are children who will have normal speech language abilities over time, a group that's resilient, that starts out with some delays, but either through therapy or through better developmental, or a lot of work, I'm sure, by their parents, they are resilient and they catch up. That's the blue line. And then we have other children in orange who early on may show a slight delay, but that increases over time. And so these are the kids that we really, in this study, are trying to pick up and try to figure out earlier that they're at risk for increasing problems over time because they can really benefit from therapy. So the study I'll talk about with you today is a 5-year longitudinal study that started in March of 2020, right as COVID became a new word in our vocabulary. We were lucky to find that we got funding. So it's probably the world's worst time to start a longitudinal study. But nevertheless, through the work of that big team that I showed you at the beginning, and especially our research coordinators and all the nurses who helped us, babies were still coming in. They were still being born during that time. They were still coming into the NICU. And these parents are really, they really want to know that their child is doing okay. They've been through such a traumatic period. So actually, despite COVID, as soon as we were able to open back up, we were able to start enrolling. And we've really had a lot of success during this time enrolling these children and following them so far. So our long-term goals are to improve predictions of speech, language, and literacy deficits, and to try to do that so we can facilitate identification and intervention during what we know is the peak neuroplasticity window in infants, or earlier than 2. And those of you who work with children know that the earlier they get hearing aids, the better. The earlier they get cochlear implants, the better. And it's exactly the same idea here. The problem with speech language deficits is that we take more of a wait to fail approach, where we wait until the child is very delayed before they're offered therapy. And that's what we want to change. We want to facilitate earlier and more effective intervention by finding them sooner. And you can see that on this graph, that if we have early detection and add to that intervention, which you all are experts in, that's where we will get the better outcomes. We are sure about that. So the way that this study is working is that we enroll children when they're preterm, so they have to be 32 weeks or less. They have to not have really major brain anomalies or syndromes that we know are associated with speech language problems like cleft palate or Down syndrome. We're not enrolling those children. So we're enrolling children where there's, it's gray. We don't know if they're going to do really, really well. Like these little pumpkins up here on the right side, these are children who have come in and they just look spectacular. Their development looks really good. We don't know, when they're first in the NICU, how their course is going to look. So we enroll them then. They get an MRI scan at term equivalent birth as part of the study. But this is sort of a super duper, what we call resting state functional MRI, where we're really trying to look at areas of the brain that will be important for speech and language development. They also get an anatomic type ABR or MRI so that if there are problems, we're able to find out and the parents get that information. And that's one of the reasons they want to be in the study, is to get that extra information they wouldn't get otherwise. That includes an extra ABR, and we're doing a threshold ABR all the way down to the lowest levels we can at both 1 and 8 kilohertz. So we're interested in the higher frequency region. So we're doing that higher frequency ABR. We're also doing a speech-evoked EEG with syllables, ba and da, where we're looking for speech contrasts and the brain's ability to pick those up. And we do that with a high-density electrode cap that has 124 channels that we're able to then analyze later on. In between, we get caregiver questionnaires on the home environment. Are they reading to the child? Do they have educational toys? Things like that. And then we do our speech, language, and hearing assessments at age 2 and 3 years of age, the behavioral hearing assessment as shown here, and then a speech language assessment, and I'll tell you more about those, what they consist of. So we have the older cohort where we didn't have the EEG and ABR measures early on, but we're doing everything at the 2 and 3 year age range, and they had MRI as well. And in addition to that, we have 149 new babies that we enrolled in this post-COVID period. So the first cohort was pre-COVID, second cohort was post-COVID. It might be interesting to just look at that in respect to their speech, language, and social skills. But that's not the reason for the study, but it's going to be possible. But we have 149 in the new cohort who we enrolled and scanned with MRI. Of those, 74% were very preterm, 26% extremely. You can see we have some nice diversity with 25% who are Black, 5% other, and 8% Hispanic or Latino. And then you can see the risk factors over here. Of course, all of them spent more than 5 days in the NICU, but we also have a fair number who had aminoglycosides. I know Peter wants to know more about this. And also 17%, because this was pre-vaccine, 17% of the birth moms had a COVID-19 diagnosis while they were pregnant, and we know that's a high risk factor for prematurity. Not so far for hearing, but we're certainly going to be looking at that. And then only 5% failed their newborn hearing screen, and 5% had a family history of hearing loss. So the MRI that I described earlier is done in natural sleep. We don't sedate any of the babies for the MRI. And so that's where this wonderful lady down here has made this study possible, because she became like a baby whisperer. She would swaddle the babies, and the MRI techs are extremely good at doing this in natural sleep. So we were able to get on 149 babies full MRIs. If they didn't get them, they weren't able to continue in the study, and that was about 20%. So we actually enrolled more babies, but not all of them had a full MRI. Of those, if we use something called the Keto-Coro brain abnormality scoring system, you can see that only 28% of these babies are classified as having completely normal brain scans at birth. 45% have mild abnormalities, and then 16% moderate, 11% severe. So this is really quite a wide range already at birth. But we also know that because of neuroplasticity, despite these problems with the brain, if the child has enough stimulation and things go well from there, they can still do very well. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have problems. And in fact, we have so far not found this brain abnormality scoring to be that predictive for language. Some other things, though, that may be present and are frequently present is something called diffuse white matter abnormalities, or more subtle types of brain problems. And this is a particular interest of Dr. Parikh, who's been working on this and has found that if they use advanced MRI techniques, you can do a good job at predicting motor outcomes. So they've been able to get to where they can predict with better than 95% confidence children who will later on be diagnosed with cerebral palsy. But unfortunately, we haven't gotten there yet with language scores on the advanced MRI. So there's a need for more sensitive early biomarkers to identify preterm infants at risk for language impairment. And so this is something that we're continuing to work on and to look at using machine learning techniques. Our hearing assessment methods, we have tried to use the most advanced methods that we could that are clinically feasible at this age. So we use distortion product otoacoustic emissions, or OAEs, to measure inner ear function. And we're measuring that out to 10 kilohertz to get the higher frequency information. We're using something called wideband tympanometry, which is just as it sounds, it's a wide frequency way to look at middle ear function. So it goes beyond the typical tympanogram that can only measure at one frequency. And that's at birth. And then again, we do that earlier or later at age 2 to 3 years. We use those same techniques. But then in addition to that, at 3 months, we're doing a complete ABR, and we're using some special stimuli that allow us to go really high in frequency. And then at age 2 to 3 years, we're doing visual reinforced audiometry or conditioned play, and we're including 8 kilohertz. A lot of times audiologists sort of stop at 4 kilohertz and we don't go higher, but we really should, because these children are at risk for higher frequency hearing loss with a lot of the problems that they've had with the preterm birth. Okay, so finally I have some data to show you. So this is, and I'm highlighting Dr. Blankenship, who's done a lot of this work and this analysis. So the ABR thresholds that we did, and just to cue you in on the ABR, you can see that over here on the right side. So we have a series of waveforms, which when we're at higher intensities like 70 dB, you can see them very clearly. But when we go down, 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 down and level, they eventually disappear. And we call that the ABR threshold. And we know that that correlates very strongly with the actual hearing threshold. Even though this doesn't tell us how the baby's hearing, it tells us at what level the auditory system is capable of responding. Okay, so if we look at the thresholds over here for 1 kilohertz, we know what normal is there. And so we have this group of normal, and so that's how we're classifying them as normal, is based on their 1 kilohertz threshold, which is well understood. And you can see we have this whole group of children that apparently have hearing loss at 1 kilohertz, even though very few of them didn't pass newborn screening. So there's something going on with hearing with these children at 1 kilohertz. And then if we look at 8 kilohertz, so classified on their 1 kilohertz threshold, you can see here's their 8 kilohertz threshold. So these are probably in the normal range. And these, we can see a big difference at 8 kilohertz. So we've got children with both a 1 and 8 kilohertz threshold. And when we looked at the correlation, they actually correlate quite well. So most of the hearing losses that we're looking at are probably flat, not just high frequency, but adding in this high frequency information is really helpful. Okay, and then so if we go ahead and we kind of group that down into type of hearing loss and then degree of hearing loss, you can see that, and this is based on the ABR at 3 months, you can see that overall only 68% were completely normal. We had 18% that were classified as sensory neural, and we used their bone conduction ABR to help classify that, as well as the wideband reflectance tympanometry. And then we've got 12% that were conductive. Okay, you can understand that might not have been picked up with newborn screening because maybe it wasn't present at birth, but came on later, because this is at 3 months. So they can start, having otitis media, or maybe they had fluid, because babies in the NICU are at higher risk for otitis media as well. And then 2% we weren't able to determine because we didn't have good bone conduction on them. So we're not sure if that's conductive or sensory neural. So pretty high rates of hearing loss. And if we look at the degree of loss, you can see these are the ones that I was talking about, like that iceberg, that are under the radar, this 19% slight hearing loss. Newborn screening isn't designed to pick that up, but nevertheless, it is a hearing loss. Mild hearing loss in 10%. Again, some of those may not have been picked up. The moderate to severe, we would expect those to be picked up with newborn screening. So that actually correlates pretty well with the 5% who didn't pass newborn screening. Okay, I had mentioned earlier that we're doing this EEG to speech syllable, so I want to tell you a little bit about how that works. We're using ba and da stimuli, and we're getting an overall cortical response to each of those syllables, so for ba and for da, and you can see the sound spectrogram for them here. They differ only, of course, in place of articulation, so the vowel is the same, and they also differ in voice onset time. But they're both, voiced consonants. And then we have what's called a mismatch response. This has been studied and it has been shown in some studies, but not all, to be predictive of later language outcomes. So because it's not always predictive, we didn't want to hang our hat just on the mismatched response, but we're doing that in addition to an overall cortical response. What the mismatch response shows us is the difference between the ba syllable and the da syllable is right here. And you get this, in infants, you get a positivity that the brain has recognized, oh, I'm hearing something different. I'm going to respond to that differently. And so that's what we're really looking for with this mismatch response. As part of that, we did a very simple analysis first. This is our first set of results. We're not done analyzing the mismatch response yet, so I don't have those results to show you yet. But we did something simpler, which is looking at what's called resting state EEG. So this is before we give any stimulus, so before we do the syllables, but we're looking at different frequency bands in terms of how the brain overall is responding or is, sort of wired. And the lower frequencies are delta, and then as we step up, theta, alpha, and beta are different bands in that overall EEG energy that we're getting from all those electrodes. And we look at something called relative power. And what we find is that we found a correlation with the degree of hearing level by ABR. So this is at 3 months of age. So basically, the poorer the hearing, the higher was the delta energy, which is an abnormal signature of brain energy. And we see that more often in babies who were born preterm, where the delta energy is increased. The higher frequencies were actually decreased. So it went the opposite way when there was hearing loss. And this has been shown in kids with more severe hearing losses, but to our knowledge, it hasn't been shown before in these really mild degrees of hearing loss. Now, it's not a huge correlation, but it is significant even in a relatively small sample size. And we're seeing it across all of the bands, but especially the beta, the very high frequency band, and the delta, the very low frequency band, so that it's this inverted sort of response. So what that tells us is that already at 3 months of age, the brain is reacting differently when hearing loss is present. So in summary, at 3 months of age, what we found was that 27% of these babies who were born preterm had moderate to severe brain abnormalities. 32% had conductive or sensorineural hearing loss, but most of these hearing losses were slight to mild in degree. So they wouldn't normally probably come to your attention. They wouldn't be fit with hearing aids. Even children that have mild hearing loss often are not receiving amplification, even though we really feel they should be. 89% of these hearing losses were not detected by newborn hearing screening. And we found that this hearing loss, even though, we've talked about it previously as being minimal hearing loss, it is related to neural activity at the same age. We don't know how it's going to look later or if it's going to be predictive of those later language outcomes, but that's what we're intending to look at. So far, these results reinforce the JCIH recommendations to follow up babies who were cared for in the NICU for more than 5 days, even if they passed newborn hearing screening. So that's not new, but it certainly reinforces that. Okay, so then at 2 and 3 years of age, I'm going to talk with you about the older cohort who we weren't able to do ABR on at birth, but we're now doing behavioral on, and we finished up all of our results at 2 and 3 years of age. So I have a complete set of data to tell you about here, and we also have language, so that's exciting. So I'll show you how we do testing using conditioned play audiometry. It's saying my internet connection is unstable, so I hope my voice is okay. Someone please tell me if it's not. So we have a child in the high chair usually. If they need to be in mom's lap, we'll do that, but we really like to have them in the high chair so that we can kind of control the situation and have the child just focused on that, so the parent's not having to do both. And I'm a big believer in always getting ear-specific results whenever we can. But if we have children who won't tolerate earphones, of course, we'll do sound field. Usually then by 3 years of age, we're able to get ear-specific results. But we go through this training, and I'll just show you what that looks like here. And I want to make sure that I am sharing my sound before I do that, so that you will be sure to hear it well. And let's just do a little sound check, and maybe Peter or someone can tell me if it's okay.
Listening for the birdies.
In terms of the sound. Do a little bit more.
Yeah. Listen for birdies. Basket. Not yet. Shh. There's the birdies. Did you hear them? Good job. A turkey. Let's listen for the birdies again. Ball. Can you hear the birdies? Can you hear the birds? Put it in. Yay! Good job. And pink and yellow. Okay, pink and yellow.
So that's the basic technique that we use. And this little one, she's pretty sassy, but she's really good at doing the job, even at this age, at 2 years of age, with conditioned play. So we will use VRA if we need to, if the child isn't as developmentally able, or we'll use conditioned play. And then we do this in-between one, which is where we'll still use VRA, but we'll use the motor task to reward them. Because a lot of times the 2-year-olds are hard to test because they just want to get in there and do it. They want to play the game. And so we'll use the game as the reward rather than expecting them to do it. If they're not quite developmentally ready, like this little one was, we can use that in between, if that makes sense, like a combination of VRA and conditioned play. And I know all the pediatric audiologists in the audience say, yeah, that's what I do too. Okay.
Listening for the birdies.
A lot of adaptations for different developmental needs, because a lot of these children have different needs. A lot of them have visual loss, or they have motor problems, or some of them have autism spectrum disorder and other issues that make it more difficult to find a good way for them to respond. And so one of the things you can do is a picture exchange system, or PECS, to help for communication if the child is developmentally delayed or delayed in speech and language. For those children who have a lot of anxiety or who have autism spectrum disorder, a social storybook can help prepare them for the clinic visits and help decrease their anxiety and improve the results. So those are all techniques that we can use. I am a big fan now of conditioned play audiometry on a tablet. This is something that was developed by Children's Mercy. And they've done a wonderful job at putting together not only the ability to test spondees or different words as shown here, but all kinds of other conditioned play audiometry scenes. And if you're working with kids who have hearing aids or cochlear implants, and you need something more engaging and that they can do over and over and over again, you can use this because the child can select the scene they want, and then when they respond, they get a different part of the scene that comes through each time. And so it's really motivating and rewarding. Works really well from about age 3 and up. And I think it'd be a great therapy tool too, because there's lots of different naming that would go on in different categories, like for the farm or for the fish and so forth. So it's great for that use as well. And a lot of kids love it. Here's an example of using that tablet with a little boy who's 3 who has cerebral palsy. So because he doesn't have great trunk or head support, he needs the wheelchair that he's in. So we will test the child in the way that works best for them. And we're doing, again, here, the insert earphones. And this is Veronica, our research coordinator, working with this little guy.
Where's that one? Popcorn. No, she didn't say popcorn. We're going to listen again and see what word Miss Lisa says. Yeah, you heard her. Go ahead and tap it. Popcorn.
Oh,
there you go. Great job.
He's still able to do that. And he found this really rewarding. And he uses a communication board a lot. So kids are often familiar with it, and it works well for them to do that when we're testing. Okay, so here are some results from our 2 to 3-year-olds for 128 children, where we were able to get results. And we were able to get results on 95% by the age of 3. So using, these techniques and just having enough time to work with them, bringing them back for an extra visit if needed, was really successful for us. And what you can see over here for the audiogram, the children that have normal hearing classified as better than 15 dB, they have really normal hearing. Like, you can get very good thresholds on these children, even at age 2 to 3. It's a little bit elevated at 1 kilohertz, but gets better with higher frequencies. And this exactly matches up what we've seen developmentally from older studies that have looked at hearing thresholds for young kids. The ones that have hearing loss, obviously a lot more variable. These are very slight to mild hearing losses overall. And then if we look at how that correlates with otoacoustic emissions as a cross-check, you can see what we would expect to see, that the ones with normal hearing have much better otoacoustic emissions, as shown here in blue. So higher is better here, the opposite of the audiogram. And the ones that have hearing loss have much lower otoacoustic emissions, and especially in these high frequencies around 8 kilohertz and so forth. So we're going to be interested in looking at these OAE results related to some of the risk factors that they've had. And then the wideband absorbance technique that I talked about for detecting conductive hearing loss, what that shows is that it's a very broad frequency range where conductive hearing loss has an impact. And similar to when we look at hearing, we're finding that the low frequencies and the higher frequencies are the most affected at this age, with relatively less of a difference between the conductive ears, which are in orange, and the normal hearing ears, which are in blue. And the really cool thing is that if we compare that to bone conduction, what we find is better than 95% performance for detecting conductive hearing loss with this technique. And that's really important because it can be very hard at this age or in the younger age to, especially with these really slight hearing losses, to differentiate between conductive and sensory neural loss. I really think we should be doing this at the time of newborn screening. It's a technique that could be incorporated along with an OAE so that we would have less of that limbo, less of that uncertainty about whether we were dealing with a permanent hearing loss that needs immediate intervention or whether we're dealing with a conductive loss that might be temporary and needs medical treatment first before we go forward. So for the 2 to 3-year-olds, this is the summary of hearing loss. We actually have a pretty similar proportion that have some degree of hearing loss compared to that 3-month time window. But there's an important difference. More of the kids at 2 to 3 years of age had conductive loss than did sensory neural. We had 4% sensory neural losses, which is still pretty high, but most of the losses that we found were conductive. So why is this different from what we found at 3 years of age? We're not sure. This is what we're trying to delve into and find out about. And you can see the degree of loss over here is kind of similar. Most of them are slight to mild. A few are moderate, no severe ones, and then some that were unknown. Let's see, let me get this window out of the way. Oh, undetected hearing or unknown degree of hearing loss in 2% because we couldn't get full results. So pretty similar in terms of the percent that have hearing loss, pretty similar in terms of the degree, but kind of an open question about the sensory neural versus conductive loss. Now, these are 2 different cohorts. So one was enrolled pre-COVID, one was post-COVID. I'm not trying to say this is anything to do with COVID. We don't know that yet. But there could be differences in the cohorts that we'll be looking at. It's a different technique, ABR versus behavioral. It could be that some of these kids had hearing loss that was just skating on the edge, and then maybe over time medically they improved. That seems unlikely with a sensory neural loss, but all of those questions are something that we'll be looking into further. And the really important thing that we're trying to detect is our language outcomes. So at 2 years of age, it's a very hard time to get a really thorough language sample, but what we're doing is something called the Communication and Symbolic Behavior Scales, or CSBS. This is a direct standardized assessment, but it's really geared to young children and especially the preterm population because it's very naturalistic. So you can see this little boy over here that's sitting down. The child just thinks they're playing a game. They have no idea they're being tested for language. This little one is being given to zoos. What we want to know is, do they understand how to use toys? Can they follow directions? And then any verbal language that they have, it's all recorded. So it takes about an hour. We record every word, every syllable that they say. It takes 2 to 3 hours to score it. So we have this whole big group of graduate students who's helping us with that. But it's a very in-depth sort of assessment that looks at nonverbal as well as verbal communication. So it allows for a range of language performance in children who are delayed in using words. And one really cool thing that we have found, and this is Lauren's doctoral thesis, is that our preliminary results so far, when we compare white and Black children, we find exactly the same performance, no difference based on race. And this is, I think, the only scale that we've seen where we didn't find a difference based on race. So some of the other language measures that may have more racial bias in them may show more of a racial difference. But in terms of language and communication abilities, at this 2-year age, we did not find a difference between the children in our study who are white or Black. And then, but what we did find is a real relationship between hearing level and language scores using the TELD, or the test of early language development, at age 3 years. So we've got our 2-year and our 3-year language. And when we look at our 3-year language, so longer term, compared to the hearing levels at 2 to 3 years, what we're showing here is the hearing levels for both ears, averaged from 0 up through 50 dB, compared to their receptive language and compared to their expressive language. And these little graphs up here show you the hearing levels, kind of that bell-shaped curve, and then the language scores. And what we're finding is a significant relationship between degree of hearing and language scores. But what's interesting is that we have these cluster of kids down here who, despite having normal hearing, have really poor language. So obviously hearing isn't the reason, but there's something else going on. So this is going to require looking at multiple factors to find out what's predicting these language abilities. And we did find that even when we controlled for what we call social risk score, so that's parents' education, their zip code where they live, and so forth, that these relationships between hearing and language held firm. So it was not explained by social risk factors. So in summary, for the 2 to 3 year olds, we found 20% of cases had conductive or sensory neural hearing loss. 5% were incomplete, so the rate could be higher than that. And the mild hearing loss was related to language outcomes at 3 years. So again, reinforcing the need to continue hearing follow-up long-term for these high-risk kids, and also to look for conductive loss, because that seems to be common out to age 3 years in this preterm population. So I want to talk a little bit about management strategies in the time that I have remaining. So this is one, I came up with this silly acronym called HEAR. So I'll take credit for that. But this is management of infants with mild hearing loss. So the first thing that's important is for parents to understand this hearing bubble. I know you talk a lot about that with kids with more, higher degrees of hearing loss. But whenever they can communicate with a baby at close range, that's so much better. So spending one-to-one time with the baby, like is shown here with this dad, and maximizing language and repetition while they reduce background noise. So turning off TV, turning off radio or other machines, getting into a quiet room to have that story time is so important. Enhancing the speech environment. So this is a very family-centered kind of approach. There's good evidence for what's called parentese. So the way that we talk to young babies is very, very helpful for them in terms of learning language. Teaching parents about dialogic reading, which is the conversational, more storytelling approach, as opposed to just reading the book as it is, expanding on it, bringing in more vocabulary, watching for the child's interest, what they want to focus on. And this, in a therapy approach could be monitored for synchrony with a Lena device, where we're looking for how much are the parents talking to the kids, and help them to understand the more they talk to their children, the better their language is going to be. Amplifications should certainly be considered. It doesn't have to be hearing aids, especially for slight to mild loss. We could try sound field or body-worn speakers. These are more simple, more inexpensive, especially for parents that may be reticent to use hearing aids for these children that have slight to mild loss. Could consider personal hearing aids, especially if there's hearing loss across the board, flat hearing loss across frequencies. We should also consider remote microphones worn by caregivers, whether that's FM, Bluetooth, or other means. This is especially suited for infants with mild hearing loss who don't need lots of amplification. And there's good evidence for efficacy, even for children who have normal hearing but have language learning problems. So I want to show you a program that's in our NICU at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I'd like to do a little shameless plug because just this last week, in the U.S. News and World Report, we made it to #1 in children's hospitals in the U.S. So we jumped over Boston and Philadelphia right to #1, and we couldn't be more thrilled about that, of course. And I'm even more thrilled for my neonatology colleagues because the neonatology department was also ranked #1 in the nation in this last U.S. News and World Report. So with that, I want to show you this little video that was put together by some of our reading and pediatrics colleagues.
Do you like green eggs and ham?
With every word.
I do not like them, Sam.
And every touch. Parents at the Newborn Intensive Care Unit at Cincinnati Children's are helping their babies in a number of ways.
I like to watch his reactions, even though I know he's young, but it just seems like he reacts to the things that I say when I read sometimes. Sometimes he jumps when he's awake.
A new literacy initiative called the NICU Bookworm Program recently launched to help parents learn about the importance of reading to their babies soon after birth.
The current trend in brain science is to really go younger and younger. We're learning that the most rapid stage of brain development is in the first 5 years, and even in the first couple of years. That's when the brain pretty much doubles in size. There's really, really robust connections going on. So all these things are responsive to stimulation, whether it's from being held or hearing language. And as far as books, that stimulates the brain in all kinds of ways.
It makes it feel like home. I'm sorry. Yeah, it just makes me feel like a little more home, like it takes you away from all the medical stuff. And the fact that I can sit here on the little hospital couch and have it feel not like a hospital for 5 minutes is great.
There's the redbird you love, Cyrus. Redbird, redbird, what do you see? I feel like we're really making a difference. I love to read. I'm an avid reader and I wanted to pass it on.
The girl I choose is just as sweet as a delicious...
Reading and sharing books also creates a bonding experience during what can be a difficult and emotional time.
Getting that comfort level is really important. Part of it is the reading development, but part of it is the interaction between the parent and child. And for many families, that's 15 minutes of special one-on-one interaction on a book once a day can be a very powerful thing.
You give the best hugs in the whole wide world. We crown you now with ribbons and berries and name you the princess of all the fairies. The end.
All right. So with that, I just want to say thank you with my favorite type of dog, a golden retriever. And I hope we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Lisa. That was fabulous. And we do have a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to read them out for you. If you have your chat up, you may be able to read along. But the first one I would like to refer to read out is, what auditory intervention in those with mild hearing loss would you recommend for children with mild hearing loss, and how do we get the pediatricians and parents on board? Probably because most parents would not understand the importance when they don't see that hearing loss in their child.
Yes, that's sort of what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about those different ideas for intervention. So I think, the hearing bubble, the enhanced speech environment, that should be done with every child, actually, whether they have hearing loss or not. This is the best way to parent children, but especially for those that have hearing loss, if they don't do anything else, if they would do this type of, and really focus on it and make sure that they're spending time every day, one-to-one with that child in that close environment, quiet, turning off everything else. And if they understand that the more that they do that, and the more language they get in at close range, the better it's going to be for that child. So some parents don't want to use personal amplification I think it should always be offered when there's mild hearing loss, but some parents aren't ready for it, but they can do these other things. And this idea about, sound field, there's some things where it's sort of like a little speaker. And if they would have that on when they're reading to the child, and that's, a type of remote microphone that they can wear, even if they're not using personal hearing aids, they can use that type of amplification device. And those are relatively inexpensive. And so talking with an audiologist about trying some of those things, and the audiologists in the audience, please think about it. What can you do that will help parents to accept amplification more readily, to use it with these more slight to mild hearing losses when they are detected? Especially when there's, conductive loss, we didn't have children in our study who had like Down syndrome or cleft palate, but of course they're going to be having hearing loss over and over and over again. So using something like a sound field sort of system can address that without, the problems that happen when you're using personal hearing aids, especially when there are PE tubes and drainage and that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That's really important, and thank you for emphasizing that. And again, it's another example of how interventions or activities that we can do with infants that help children with hearing loss, in fact, help every child of that age to grow and develop to their maximum potential. So that's really good. Another question that came up is, can you clarify if the assessment dates that you used in your study, particularly for the earlier age points, like at 3 months, are they with gestational age, or are they for corrected age?
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. They are corrected for gestational age, even all the way out to 3. And that's based on, recommendation by our neonatologists that children continue to have that correction for gestational age through at least age 3.
Okay, great, super. We have time for a couple more questions that are in the chat, and one of them is, did you control for any participants that are born with congenital CMV infection?
So I am not aware that we have children that were diagnosed with congenital CMV, but we know that they must be there. And so that's information that we're collecting, is whether there's any intrauterine infection, including CMV, that was detected. We haven't yet analyzed for that. We have looked at whether they had ototoxic medications, what type of ventilation.
Okay, I'm sorry, Lisa, but we have to end here. Okay. Everyone, please thank Lisa. That was a fabulous talk and presentation to the symposium to kick it off. And so great. And I will be catching up with you later, Lisa. Okay.
Great.
Have a great symposium, everyone.
Thank you.